So I guess you're relatively newly diagnosed at the age of 31, correct? So why don't you tell
Yeah.
me about kind of what was going on in your life that led to you thinking maybe I should look into this ADHD thing, and kind of what was leading up to your diagnosis?
Okay, so it's kind of a long story, I
It
think, as it
always
is
is.
for most people, right? So it started with sleep, right? So sleep is like foundational because I've had so many problems in my life with sleep. Sleep has been like the bedrock of my anxiety for so long. So I was about to start a PhD program, and I was just thinking about all the work that I would have to do over the next several years. And I went several days just not being able to fall asleep. And that's been pretty consistent throughout my life. It's been pretty hard for me to sleep at night because I'm always up at night thinking and worrying and finally remembering that I forgot to give a table some ranch as a server. And so it's been really hard to sleep at night. And so I was really struggling, and I had to go to a psychiatry appointment because it had been, several days, and I was not able to fall asleep. And I go in, and at this point, I think I'm 27 or 28, and she says, "Oh, I think that you're bipolar manic right now." And I'm like, "Oh no, really? I've never like had this happen before where I'm awake for several days at a time. Is it possible that I'm bipolar manic right now?" And she's like, "Yeah, that's exactly what's happening." So she puts me on some bipolar medication that makes me feel verifiably insane and does
Oh,
not make me
really?
feel very, oh yeah.
What was it doing? Can I ask?
It made me feel like my heart was beating faster and slower at the same time, and my thoughts were just so like even more delayed than typical for me.
Yeah.
It was just really hard to formulate a thought. So I kind of lost hope in therapy for a while, and went back and was like, I totally disagree with your diagnosis. And she's like, "Okay, well, here's some anxiety medication." So fast forward to several years later, my husband and I get a divorce, which pushes me back into therapy, right? And so I'm explaining to her, all of these things that have happened in my life. And she's like, "Have you ever considered for a moment that it might be ADHD?" And I was
This is
like,
a new therapist, right? Not the same one
yeah, yeah,
who diagnosed you with bipolar manic. Okay.
yeah, right. So totally new therapist. So she's like, "Have you ever considered, just for 1 second, that maybe it's ADHD?" And I was like, no, never. I live in Kentucky where childhood ADHD diagnoses are pretty prevalent, right? It's one of the most prevalent places in the country for children to be diagnosed with ADHD. And so I had this like formulation in my head, as we all do, that ADHD was what little boys who were very rowdy were diagnosed with. And I was like, "No, I've never considered that for 5 minutes." And she's like, "Okay, well, I can't, put you on any medications for it," because she was a licensed clinical social worker. But she's like, "I highly recommend reaching out to a psychiatrist or someone that can help you with this." So it took me a year to get into psychiatry from that point. And here's why. So I would schedule the appointment, and then I would forget that I scheduled the appointment. And then I didn't go, of course. And then it just took me so long to even schedule the appointment in the first place because I was like, "I need to do this, and I know I do, but I just don't want to do it." And and then it took me, I think, 4 canceled appointments. Like I would like call and cancel like 5 minutes right before because I'd be like, "Oh, it's in 5 minutes, and I'll totally forget that it's happening." Or I would just totally forget that the appointment was real in the first place because it was on a pink post-it note somewhere in my bedroom, and I don't have access to that right now. But I finally got in and was able to stick to it only because I was like, "Okay, I'm flunking out in my PhD program at this point. Opening my laptop gives me severe anxiety. I have got to get help. Like we're to a
Mm.
point right now where I'm spiraling. I'm about to get fired. This is not good." So I go in, and the diagnosis process was, it was fairly simple. It wasn't the monster that I made it out to be in my head. And that was now about a month ago. So this is all still pretty fresh that I've had like my psychiatrist diagnose me, and I've gotten back into therapy again. Um, yeah, so I am right there at the beginning of the process, and falling in love with finally knowing what's wrong with me.
It is, isn't it? Just like, it's so difficult to articulate to other people how mind-blowing it is when when you get this diagnosis and you start connecting the dots, especially when you've been kind of had this misconception about what ADHD is and what it looks like, and these seemingly random struggles that you have throughout your life that all kind of tie together. And yeah, and so it doesn't, I mean, it's unfortunate that you had a medical provider who thought bipolar manic, because I've talked to so many people, so many women, and I myself thought I was bipolar before I received my ADHD diagnosis because of, the things that you were talking about, the like obsessive thinking and manic energy, and yeah, I mean, there is so many kind of parallels and overlaps, and yeah, so wow.
Oh yeah, she had me pretty convinced too. She was like, "So do you ever just go shopping randomly and spend money?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, like all the time." Like I like love going shopping, and I didn't realize it's because I was chasing the dopamine, right? So it was really easy for me to just hop on Amazon when I'm feeling very understimulated and buy something that's going to make me very happy.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like I was blowing my entire life savings on a yacht to cruise around the Atlantic. It was just like, oh yeah, I could totally use that new skirt. It's going to make me really happy right now. So she had me really convinced, and then I was like, some of these things actually don't make sense because this has been a problem consistently. Like I don't have episodes. This is just who I am.
Yeah, right. And I think that is really why it feels so confusing to kind of go through and um try to figure out what is connected and what is the cause. And especially when so many of us are misdiagnosed with other mood disorders, and you're like, oh wait, living a life undiagnosed is kind of the trauma itself when you talk about all of these mood disorders. So yeah, it is mind-blowing. So now when you were first diagnosed and really started looking into it, and I'm assuming hyper focusing on ADHD as we do as we do when we start connecting those dots, like what were some of the things looking back in your life where you were like, holy crap, the signs were there all along?
Oh my goodness. So I am on TikTok. I am 31, but I'm also very in love with TikTok. I know my 19-year-old sister makes fun of me for it. So I'm very well versed in just typing in ADHD and then just falling down the rabbit hole of ADHD TikTok. It is
Mm-hmm.
so fascinating to see how many things that I've just thought were personal flaws that are just part of me being just a little different in the way that I think. Like one thing that I've noticed that I hear kind of rarely, but I'm still hearing is hyper focusing in love. So
Mm.
ADHD dating, I think, is a little different than neurotypical dating. When I first meet someone, it is just all dopamine. It is all dopamine. All the dopamine is found in that new person. And I like to just push the relationship right along because I'm like, oh yeah, like this is just making me so happy. And I hyper focus on this person. And then I learn everything about them. And at one point, I was really convinced that I was narcissistic love bombing because I'm like, okay, I am like hyper focusing on these people, and then a few months later, when the dopamine's gone, focused on something else, and all of those things that I was doing for that person in the beginning of the relationship. I'm not doing that anymore because I'm focused on something else now. And so they're like, what did I do wrong? What's happening? And it's like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm just learning how to knit. Just learning how to play the ukulele. Uh, I'm not. I'm not as invested in like hearing your family's history anymore because I have to learn how to knit this sweater before tomorrow. uh,
I have to be the
so
fastest knitter on the planet.
right. And then I'll knit a sweater and it's like, okay, that was interesting. Now I'm gonna go buy a ukulele. These are real things that have happened in my life. It's like, okay, so I did learn how to knit that. Totally done with that now. That's no longer making me happy. Now we're gonna go learn how to play the ukulele. So then I'll learn how to play a really cool song on ukulele. And it's like, okay, that was great. Fun times. Now we're gonna get really into comic books. Let's go buy all the comic books. So my apartment is like an assemblage hobbies of past lives that just live in every corner of my place, because it's I don't know, like I didn't realize that that was part of ADHD, but apparently it is. I'm seeing a lot of people that are kind of going through that. But sort of on a more somber note, I think one of the things I didn't really realize was part of this too was consistently feeling like you're too much for people. So my friends throughout, I mean, it's been kind of hard to make friends because I'm really awkward socially, I think. Like I don't really have a filter, and I'm just like, oh yeah, like let me say this right now. I know that you were just talking. That can wait. I have to get this out right now. And I'm always the last person laughing and the loudest person laughing, and just like the loudest person in the conversation in general. And so throughout life, it's been like, oh, like we don't really talk to Alisha because she's too much. We don't want to like get her all wound up, or things that I've heard, or like, you're way up here, I'm gonna need you to bring it down to here. Because I do get very hyperactive sometimes. I know that that's not like super common for women, I guess, but I tend to just bounce off the walls every now and again. And it's really frustrating for people, and I come off as a rude asshole, if I'm being honest with you, because I just come off like I have no regard for people in social settings. But I can't help it. It's not on purpose.
No, I mean, I think this is a theme we talk about a lot. I certainly have had that experience where like I come in hot, like you said, like I hyper focus on people. And even back in like middle school and high school, my friendships were like that, where it would be like obsessively kind of bonding with somebody and then doing something inadvertently to offend that person or anger that person or something, like being either too much or just sort of like a bad friend, but not really doing it intentionally or even understanding what is happening, and then all of a sudden that person has dumped me and sort of feeling like, what did I do? And it still happens to this day where like somebody will like unfriend me on Facebook and I literally have no idea what I did. And it's like you just sort of you start really fearing relationships a lot of the way, and like you said, like you start to really kind of pull back from people. It's really difficult to trust relationships, because you can't really even trust yourself a lot of the time. I think that was something that was so profound to me. Sarah Solden talked about it in her book on women with attention deficit disorder, how like we can't trust ourselves in a lot of situations. Like you were saying, like sometimes we blurt things out and we talk, and sometimes we're super like on fire and really social, and other times we just want to curl up in a ball and we have no idea how we are necessarily going to react in any given situation. And so the combination, I think, of not being able to trust who we are with people and in certain situations, and then also the chronically feeling like we have done something accidentally, and so we pull away a lot for sure.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what led to my therapist thinking that I had ADHD. Is I went in and like I think that my exact words were like, my self-trust is bankrupt. I
Mm,
can't depend on myself to wake up in the morning on time, because I'm either up all night, or people with ADHD have vastly different sleep cycles than people that don't have ADHD. So waking up on time has just consistently been a problem for me. And showing up for things when my friends need me there has consistently been a problem with me, and not being late to things, even if it's dinner. I mean, a few times my friends are like, okay, like, yeah, you were late like twice in a row, whatever. But then after a while, it's like every time we schedule a dinner, you're late. And then you get here and you just like spend the whole time talking, and we can't get a word in, or get a word in edgewise. And so yeah, like there are those things where it's like I can't even depend on myself. Like, of course, like, it's hard to maintain relationships when you're just so kind of wounded, because you think, I mean, pre-diagnosis, I honestly thought that I was just a really shitty person. Like I've spent
mhm.
31 years of my life thinking that I am just a shit person, and that I am like not to be trusted. I'm really lazy. I will sleep through anything, and I have no regard for important events in my friend's life. I thought that I was a terrible friend, and a bad teacher, because it takes me longer to grade things than it does, other teachers across the university. and I just thought that I was just a bad person, and that I really inherited all of these things as just tragic personality flaws, not realizing that it was linked to something else.
Yeah. Oh man, I know. And then the first time you hear about rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and it just hits you like a ton of bricks, where you're just like, oh my goodness, somebody is finally explaining what I have been feeling my whole life in terms of, yeah, that shame, the shame that goes along with being kind of accidentally an asshole. like, right? Like, you're really, it's that idea, and it's so hard to articulate. And I think why it's so important for us to have conversations with each other, right? And why, platforms like TikTok have been so meaningful to us, because so much of the shame around that is something we've been holding without even realizing how private, and how we haven't been addressing it, or a lot of the times we're just like, so we're just treading water, so we can't even like process all of the shame that we're feeling around a lot of this stuff, and so we don't even stop and think about it until somebody says something like, yeah, you know, um, a TikTok video about, like, being a bad friend or something. And you're like, oh yeah, like it floods over you, right? It's so emotional to be like, oh my goodness, somebody just said something I didn't even realize I had been feeling. Uh,
Or just seeing that someone else kind of goes through the same thing, like,
yeah.
oh, you cry for 3 days when someone does something that is slightly critiquing of you. Me too. Like, I also am awake every night for like 3 days just crying about it and thinking about it, and just not being able to let it go. And then it's really really hard. And then whenever those critiques do come in, and I don't want to co-opt language from ASD, but I do like to use the word masking, because I think
Mm.
that that's the best way that it is described. When you do receive those critiques, it's like immediately you have to mask. Like when your friends are like, oh, like you're being too loud, or like, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that. It's like I just shut down. Like,
Yeah.
and it becomes so like catastrophic in my head that like I just shut down, and I kind of push myself off to the side, and I've gotten really good at that. I didn't realize how many masks that I have until I started watching ADHD TikTok, and it's like, oh, okay. So the fact that I'm like, huh, what'd you say? Even though I heard you, but I just need time to process what you
I think Connor DeWolf did a video about that. Yeah, he did a really good job of that idea of like, yeah, no, I heard you. It's just like, I tell my kids, it's like it sits in the lobby for a minute before it makes it into the building. um,
I laughed so hard at that one because I am the like queen of going, huh, what'd you say? And like people know that I heard them. And so my my sister stopped responding, and she just like gives me the second now to like formulate what I want to say.
But see, that's such a great example of like accommodations and how important they are, right? Like once you kind of can explain what is happening, and then somebody can say, all right, well then I'll just help you out here. And then the cycle of shame is disrupted. And that's what I think is so important for us, is that understanding like what is happening, and then being able to at least explain, like I always say, ADHD isn't an excuse, it's an explanation. And that's as much for us as it is for other people, right? Because I think for us, we internalize so much of that, like, why am I not listening to you? Like, I don't know what's happening.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
not listening is definitely just another one of those like hallmark traits that I've noticed that I have too. So being in higher ed, obviously, like we have to listen, and being an anthropologist in general, like our whole job is kind of interviewing people and listening. And so I have to think so hard about listening and paying attention that like I'm thinking about it so much that I'm like, I'm not listening to what you're saying anymore, because
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the fact that I should be listening to you. And even, I mean, I know that like sometimes when we're wildly interested in things, we hyper focus, but sometimes even when I'm very invested in something and someone's talking, my mind is like not just in one place, like 80 different places, like thinking about a million different things. And I've noticed that sometimes even when I'm talking, my mind is not present with what my mouth is saying. So I will like talk about something, but my head is like, I wonder what the circumference of Santa Claus's belt is. I think that like
Well, that was something that always fascinated me when I would read to my children at night, right? Like I could be reading out loud Charlotte's Web and at the same time thinking a million other different thoughts and having a narrative. And even though like my mouth is saying these words out loud and like it knows the intonation and it knows how, it knows the cadence and everything, like I can read it as though I'm actually reading it. And yet I will have no clue what I have just read. uh, and like my kid
none.
would have stopped me and been like, is that true? And then I would get busted where I was like, I actually have no idea what I've been reading for the last 30 minutes. Like it just those sorts of weird quirks that now through that lens of understanding you're like, wow, that is really fascinating how our brains work like that.
Oh yeah, it's very noticeable in graduate school when you're reading like text from like the 1800s, and it's like, oh, like my head would and I would just literally rather be anywhere other than here right now. And so I can read something and then have to reread it like 7 different times, because I just can't. It's just so hard to stay in that moment when you're just, I mean, I don't know. It's certainly hard to read during graduate school when you have ADHD and like your primary job is like reading and listening to people, and it's like those are the two things that are really difficult to do. Um, so yeah, it's, I don't know if there are any other PhD students out there, but I just like can totally sympathize with them on the difficulty.
Well, this is just something else I find fascinating because you mentioned in your email to me that you never graduated high school. And so
No.
I'm always fascinated because a lot of, I would say the majority of the women I interview actually do quite well in school. I did not. I did terribly in school. And I talk about the fact that like a lot of the criticisms of my inconsistencies got me to the point where I just skipped school all the time and I stopped going. And then I would get, I would flunk and then I had to redo, I dropped out and I had to go back. And then the same thing happened again in university. I would stop going because I would get so overwhelmed by my classes and would miss the cutoff date to drop the classes. So I would get F's. And so then my GPA was destroyed and all of that stuff. So I'm curious but then I barely just got my BA just to get it. Like there was never any point where I was like, I'm going to continue to graduate school because I just felt like such a hot mess. So I'm curious. So like, backtrack a little bit. Like, what was going on in high school, and then how did you transition from that period of your life to then being, going on and doing your PhD?
So yeah, let's talk about high
It's a
school. So
roller
I'm gonna,
coaster.
yeah, yeah, it really is. So it's GED to PhD with ADHD is like my
There's
story.
your
Uh,
autobiography, right?
I know. so, yeah, high school. You probably won't be surprised to know I had an eating disorder. I was anorexic for a really long time. So I come from a deeply impoverished family, and so I think that a part of my eating disorder stemmed from food insecurity and not having access to fresh and healthy foods, or just food in general, to be honest with you. So that was definitely a key part of it. So I suffered from anorexia. I was severely underweight at various points. My health was just deteriorating. I could not focus in school at all. So I went from being in very gifted classes, and part of these like elitist like academic teams and just very advanced courses, to not coming to class at all and being in court for truancy, and uh, literally just leaving in the middle of class when I wasn't interested. Like it wasn't like I could just sit and suffer through it anymore. I would just get up and leave. And that's been a pretty common thing for me, is like if I am not interested in a course, I cannot sit through it and I'm out. Like I'll just walk away. So I even left in the middle of taking my ACTs. I had no interest in finishing it. So I mean, it wasn't a difficult test. I just didn't have like I don't know. I can't explain it. I wasn't in control in that moment. Something else was, and I just got up and left. And so
I
that
just to like interject, I think anyone listening to this podcast will 100% understand that impulse, just by the way. Like that's how kind of connected we are with ADHD. Like I absolutely understand that impulse and relate to that. So sorry. I just had to interject.
I commend the people that are able to like push past that. I cannot.
Yeah.
I you know that like DSM-5 language. It's like you're driven by a motor. Yeah, that was like one of those like motor moments for me. It's like, nope,
Mm-hmm.
she's gone. And that would happen very frequently. So that sort of just total disinterest coupled with, you know, extreme poverty and massive health issues from an eating disorder. I went until my senior year, and I'd fallen so far behind that I was going to have to take all these credit recovery classes and be in high school for another year. And I just could not stomach that. I was in court for truancy. I was working full-time hours in high school to help my family, and to just have some money. And I had to pay back like a $600 fine on like $5.25 an hour, I think was like the minimum wage back then, for being truant. So yeah, that's kind of messed up about our school system. But yeah, my family couldn't afford it, so I at 18 had to work full-time hours to pay off a truancy fee. And I just didn't go back. I ended up going to get a GED, which helped me finish sooner than my friends, which I was really excited about. So I got to get out just a little bit early. And then I took several years off and did absolute trash work. Like worked for like 18 different companies in a year because I could not keep a job. Because again, if I'm not interested in something, I just leave. And it's like, I mean, try explaining that to, you know, your partner who's deeply depending on you to help pay rent. And you're like, listen, I don't know why I just quit this other job. I know that we have no money, but I also just got up and left that one too. I'm sorry. Like I have no idea what to say. And so I just thought that I had no respect for him or me, or like I didn't care. I spent so long thinking that. And then finally went back to school, almost flunked out again, out of undergrad, and then somehow made it through a master's program with professors that are deeply interested in like making sure that their students are really cared for. And now I'm up here hanging out with other PhD students, and I have no idea how I got here, and I have no idea how I'm gonna stay. I'm at the end of the program now, and I'm finally finished with coursework. But I have no idea how I'm gonna finish it because whew, it's been really hard. It's really hard when you just don't trust yourself enough to go to class, and when you do get to class, you don't trust yourself enough to stay there. That's yeah, that's really put a lot of stress on my mental health, because I just have no trust that I can even stay seated in class and just finish the lecture or do the homework or wake up to get there in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also found that no matter how many, you know, even when I was in the undergraduate level, I would go to all the lectures, I would listen, I would take notes, I would study, like I would do all the work necessary. And then I would show up for a test and just nothing. I'd just be a blank slate. And I think that was the other feeling of like that other mistrust, which is like sometimes I can randomly explain the plot of a movie I saw in the 80s, but then other times like I could, you
Yeah.
know, have, you know, read an entire text and not be able to retain or explain any of it, and really not understanding why that is or what the difference was. And then, you know, defaulting back to, well, what is wrong with me? I must be a terrible person, or, you know, I'm not trying hard enough, or all those kind of, you know, the internalized stigma that we end up piling on ourselves. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was such a common occurrence for me. It was miserable. That, and also I would get kicked out of lectures sometimes for being too loud and disruptive. So I was the person who was like cracking jokes really loudly in the middle of a giant lecture hall, and so I thought that I was just hilarious. So I was like laughing at my mom. It's so embarrassed to admit. I think that the younger people say it's cringy. It's really cringy to look back on it. I was like, I thought that I was like this comedic genius because that was the way that I would stay engaged was to make jokes about like what the professor was saying and like laugh at it, and like I would get kicked out for being
Mm-hmm.
not one of my proudest moments. But hey, yeah, so that, and like, of course, like just the test process was really hard, because it was, I mean, I would read something and it was just like nothing would stick. It was like I was just staring at like these symbols, like these symbols that were supposedly formed words and paragraphs on a page, but to me, like it was just, yeah, it's certainly hard to read and then like actually retain that information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So now, when I was diagnosed, and I think a lot of us experience this when we're diagnosed, it's like you start going, it's genetic. So you go through your family tree and you're like, yep, Aunt Sue definitely had it. Oh yeah, Uncle Fred. Oh my God, yeah, what a train wreck. It's like you just like go through. Um, what have you talked to your family about this, and kind of what was their reaction, and are they on board, or are they supportive, or are they just like, don't be ridiculous?
So I'm from Eastern Kentucky, where mental health is just not something that most people talk about, even within like family households. It's just like not part of like our cultural capital to like talk freely about those things. Not to stereotype the whole region, of course, but like within my family, and a lot of families I know, that's certainly the truth. And so my parents know that I was recently diagnosed, and it's so funny that my mother is like the poster person for ADHD. She certainly has ADHD, and she um, she was like, okay, well, I guess that makes sense, because like we had this like long conversation about how it's not just for very hyper little boys, and she's like, well, you were kicked out of preschool for being too disruptive. You I know, it's like, okay, mother, yeah, really. And you did have some delays. Like it did take you till third grade to learn how to tie your shoes and to skip, and you didn't learn how to walk until you were 2. So you definitely did have all of these delays, and when you weren't interested in something, you just wouldn't stay. You were just gone. And so even when we tried to homeschool you in kindergarten because you were kicked out again for being too disruptive, um, we had to sit at the kitchen table, and you just would have zero interest in what was happening, and you would like tap and drum on things and just like get up and leave whenever you were done. It's like, so she was like, I do see that. And I'm like, really? You don't say. You don't say. How did you not know? And then she herself, I was actually just visiting her last night, and I'm very open with the fact that now I take medication. I'm not medicated today because I forgot, right? That's like the funniest thing in the world. Like I forgot. So today I'm just being a loose cannon. And but I was a little bit calmer yesterday because I was medicated, and I go over there and I'm talking to her about something, and right in the middle of my sentence she just like interjects with this really random thought, and she's like really excited about it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what I'm like. This is it. Like this is what people see, because like I was really calm, cool, and collected. I'm still getting used to my medicine, so I feel like I'm just like this like super chill person who can like think thoughts and do things, and she just like cuts in and interjects, and I'm like, yep, yep, I see it now. And she gets so like excited about things, and she's consistently late. She was supposed to be here earlier this afternoon. It was super late, just like me. And she's like, I think I might have ADHD. And I'm like, yeah.
Well, I
Mm-hmm.
think, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things about it being genetic, is that so many of our families, this was just the norm. This was normal. And so why would they think this was odd behavior in childhood, right? This is probably what they had done. And so they're, it's like, I feel like half of it is just like clinically not really understanding what is happening with children and kind of how it exhibits, across the board. But then at the same time, parents who are just sort of like, oh, oh, Jimmy's just being silly, like he just needs to be punished or whatever. I think it's just that idea of like, why would I think that this was a disorder of some sort? This is just childhood.
Yeah, they certainly don't think, like, I don't think that my family would view ADHD. Like, they have this very positive, I mean, like, although I just said mental health is like really stigmatized, like within our family, ADHD is just not. It's not really like, I don't think that they would view it as a disorder. My mom just thinks it's pretty cool that she is really excitable and talkative, and it's just, like, we're just known as being very loud, and we take up a lot of space, which is this like cool feminist thing, right? Like, it's like, oh, like those women, like, they just take up all the space they want, like, can't mansplain them because they will not even let you talk. So yeah, it's not really viewed as, I don't think, being a disorder to them,
That's
which is
awesome.
cool.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is great. That's one of the things, my mother passed away before I was diagnosed, and she's like the one person I really wish I could have conversations with about this, because it's just so, you just spend so much time going over, I go over my childhood all the time and my report cards in school, and just so much of it, and wanting to know, there are times where I'm like, oh yeah, she definitely had it because she, did this or this, and yeah. Yeah. So that's great. I'm so glad that they are open-minded and also see these things not as flaws, because, a lot of the time I think when people do go to their family and say, I have ADHD, I'm getting diagnosed, and they're, the idea of like, well, it's not that bad. It's just, you just need to like apply yourself, right? You just,
Oh,
it's not a big deal. You're doing fine. And their first instinct is always to um minimize, what the struggle actually is in your own life, as though it's somehow going to reflect poorly on their parenting, or that it's, I think it's the same idea of like, they'll start to think it's their fault somehow. I think, because
oh
I think
yeah.
one of the stigmas for a long time was the fact that ADHD was bad parenting. And I'm sure, when you're struggling in school at any age, right? How can your parents not feel like they are somehow to blame? I'm sure my parents did all the time.
Yeah, I think though, when you couple ADHD with pretty intense poverty, which happens a lot, um, it was really hard to it was really hard to kind of pick up on those nuances when there were just so many other daily struggles that had to be combated first. Like, it was really hard to like think about, like, how is Alicia doing in her math class, when it's like, okay, how are we going to pay rent, or like, how are we going to do this? And so
Yeah.
it was, I mean, I don't in any way, shape, or form blame them at all, for my late diagnosis, and I don't hold anything against them, because I know that they were just trying the best that they could with what they had. And seeing that, like, I was, having a really hard time in math class, and I consistently struggled here and there, or like, I stopped doing my homework for a while. I don't Yeah, like, I can see how that would, like, sort of come second to, like, how are we gonna like feed 4 kids and pay
Yeah,
rent, and yeah. So I mean, it
absolutely.
was, yeah, it's really hard. And so I think that all the nuances that exist between ADHD and poverty, I mean, it actually makes me cry, like, just to think about, like, how prevalent they kind of are together, and these life cycles that are just forever changed, because ADHD often is comorbid with things like anxiety, and it's people that are really having a hard time with these mental traits, that have it more financially difficult. And I don't know, like, what happens throughout the cycle exactly, but I mean, the relationship is just undeniable, and it's really sad.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. Thank you. I mean, I think it's true. There is such in this, I think across this country, there is such a discrepancy between um awareness of mental health and the importance of mental health, and then the systems that can support, and they just don't exist, right? I mean, there's just
Right.
like, I feel like I live in New York State. I'm a middle class, working person. I have insurance. And yet I think about like the out of pocket expenses for mental health with my family are astronomical, and not even, and I'm not even taking meds, and part of the reason I'm not taking meds is because they're so expensive, even though
Hmm.
I know that antidepressants were literally pennies a pill. So I'm curious, like with the when you said earlier that ADHD is very highly diagnosed in Kentucky in boys, um, what's the follow up to that? Because I don't imagine that there's much follow up in terms of social services and medication.
Oh yeah, no, no.
So what do they
I will
do with
say,
that
so,
diagnosis? Is it just sort of like a label that's put on kids who are the
oh yeah,
misbehaving?
yeah. So that is something, like, I'll be really vulnerable and share this. Like, this isn't really like, I feel so guilty saying this. So let's see. In 2011, this is according to the CDC, the national, let's see, the prevalence of diagnosed ADHD in Kentucky was 16.6%. Nationally, it was only 11. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a pretty big gap. And I'm seeing some articles that say that this state has the highest prevalence in children. And so I grew up thinking, and I hate to say this out loud, but I mean, this is just like what, like my former worldview. I grew up thinking that ADHD was something that hyperactive little boys had, and that their parents would go get them Ritalin. I mean, I had heard of Ritalin at a very young age, and so I thought that it was just like this medicine that these really mean little boys that I was exposed to in school would take to just calm down. And it was just part of like our family, sort of culture, like, oh, like, well, guess who put their kid on Ritalin this week?
Mm-hmm.
And it was really stigmatized and judged for what it was back then. But like, families would really harshly look at other families who chose to medicate their children. And yeah, like there was just this like sort of superior parenting culture, like, oh well, I would never put my children on anything like that because I can handle my children, or my children know better than to do this, that, or this. So yeah, it's really stigmatized, and then there just aren't very many mental health services in the region, I don't think, that can, I mean, yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, and that's another theme I feel like I explore a lot with women, when we talk about like what was available to you growing up, right? And so we do talk a lot about socioeconomic status and race and the ways in which stigma affects people based on like pre-assumptions around behavior of children, right? And so like a lot of children who are visible minorities are dismissed by their teachers as, if they have behavioral issues, it's like, oh, that kid is jail bound or whatever, like there's so many ways in which we stereotype children who before they've even had a chance for services. And I guess it
Yeah.
also goes to show like why boys are viewed as disruptive and girls might even be exhibiting the same behavior, but they're almost given a pass. Like I think there are a lot of times where girls are, work harder to be more well behaved at a younger age. But I've also interviewed women who were like, no, I was doing the exact same thing as the boy next to me. It's just he got in trouble because he was a boy. And so there is almost that like, the it's so fascinating. I'm sure as an anthropologist too, like you could probably go on and on about like how fascinating it is to talk about like gender and race and yeah, and socioeconomic status and how we are like diagnosing children and how
Oh
that's
yeah, it's
affecting your entire life in terms like I feel like people who have had proper accommodations at a very young age, they don't live their whole life with that mentality of like what's wrong with me, I am flawed, I am that, they don't view themselves as being personally flawed the way that many of us entered adulthood feeling, and how like that absolutely affects your entire self view and your narrative. And a lot of kids who received, even just like a simple dyslexia diagnosis are treated very different, or they sort of view their relationship with learning, or their relationship with like help is very different. And so it's always fascinating to me to think about like how similar and yet how different our experiences were based on
Right.
where we lived and what was available to us. And it's, yeah, it's
Right. I mean, I feel like, this region in particular is just marked by structural violence, and resource extraction, especially like out in eastern Kentucky, like out towards like the Appalachian Mountains. And it's just really difficult to see just kind of mm, how I don't even know how to say it, but yeah, it's certainly difficult, especially like when you're poor. I mean, and I'm gonna get emotional, but yeah, it's hard because then
Mhm.
you just sort of grow up with like this mentality of like, I don't fit in with the world. And so like I had so many different suicide attempts because I just felt like I didn't, like, I searched so hard for a place to fit in, but I couldn't find it. And it was like, I can only be prescribed Zoloft and Wellbutrin so many times, like, but it just wasn't working. Like I wasn't working. Like I didn't fit in with this like very Calvinistic, work hard and good things will come to you kind of like mentality of like, oh well, as you're fine as long as you're working really hard, because I couldn't work really hard. It was harder for me, right? And so like I was cast into this like undeserving poorness. Like there is like this, like there's this group of like, those who are poor but are very deserving, and then the undeserving poor who are like lazy and morally corrupt. And I feel like that's kind of like, where I was just cast in society because of people thought that I was lazy. I couldn't stick with a job. I was flunking out of school. I was, homeless at various points. I got married twice. Both times was, I mean, really rooted in the fact that I was terrified of like finding places to sleep in. And, it was hard. And I just went through so many different challenges in life that I feel like didn't need to happen.
Mhm.
And had I had the mental health support very early on, wouldn't have happened. It's been hard. I mean, it's something that I think that needs to be immediately addressed, um, because it is serious. I mean, there were so many times where I literally didn't want to be alive anymore because I didn't feel like I fit in. And I mean, I will never forgive the system for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think wow, that you covered a lot, and I appreciate how well you've been articulating this experience and this the I think a lot of it does have to do with like the Western Protestant mentality, of this like idea that independence and capableness is a moral virtue, and that if you ask for help, you are morally flawed. I think that's deeply ingrained in our system and in our
Mhm.
psyches, and I feel like that could be a whole other episode. um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it really is. I mean, it's so, gosh, it's so overwhelming. And it's why I will never tire of hearing everybody's story and how, how emotional it is. And like, how do we even begin to really start to articulate for other people what it feels like to go through life undiagnosed, and or even diagnosed. I mean, that's the other thing, is that I've spoken to women who were diagnosed in childhood and still experience a lot of these same issues. So it's whew. Now, just to like, I want to be mindful of the time, so I want to kind of shift a little bit to like,
Yeah.
now since you've been diagnosed and you're in this PhD program, like how has it shifted your thinking about how deserving you are to be in this, in the room, and it's must like I feel like for me it's so radically changed how I view myself intellectually, right? And so I imagine there's, it's been opening up a lot of windows for you, like airing out some of the shame, right? And I mean, how has your thinking been shifting? I know it's really still early on, but can
Oh yeah. So I am still very much in a grieving process right now, with this whole situation, because I'm consistently reminded, like, oh, but like, yeah, you were just diagnosed ADHD, but you're doing so good. Like, you're in a PhD program, and like you made it through 2 divorces at 30, and like you're like thriving right now. And it's like, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. But like, do you know what it's been like on this journey? Like, not to ever endorse medicine, because all bodies are different. It just so happens that my medicine and my body work very well together. And the first time I took the medicine, and with therapy is important too. I'm very much treating it right now, not just with medicine, but with so many other things like the podcast and therapy and support groups. So I just remember thinking how quiet my head was, and just how it took 0 spoons, and that like spoon theory, like how many spoons does it take to do something, how it took 0 spoons to respond to an email. And I didn't want to like sit on the floor and cry just because I got an email. I didn't have to think about writing the email for an hour and then like, finally doing it. It was just so quiet in my head, and I could just do things so effortlessly. Of course I still get distracted, but then I can get back to work. And it's been so amazing on this very new journey for me. But also, I mean, it's just really hard to grieve the person that I think I could have been, the person who could have finished high school, the person who definitely did not need to go through 2 divorces before the age of 30, the person whose life could just be so much more organized. And I, could have maybe done something really good, because I only study food insecurities, and maybe I would have come up with a new policy by now had I been diagnosed sooner. I don't know. So I suppose I feel like, as far as me deserving to be here, I feel like everyone deserves in life to get whatever it is that they want. I don't think that I have any more ability or any more claim to the pie than anyone else. But it certainly made me want to fight harder. And it certainly made the days when I'm like, yep, I'm quitting this PhD program. I'm done. I'm out. I hate this. I just can't even think about grading another paper or writing another article. It certainly made me on those days be like, we will finish this program because there is going to be one undergraduate student out there in the future who is going to be just like you were, and they're not going to want to do anything, and they're going to be tired, and they're just going to want to give up, and they're going to really blame themselves for their poverty and their mental traits and characteristics. And you're going to be the professor who comes in and it's like, no, I believe in you. Submit that assignment late. I don't care, as long as you get it to me. And so that's kind of what keeps me going right now. I don't know that I deserve to be here, but I certainly will fight to be here, and fight for a better system, in general, for my state. I think that Kentucky has a long way to go, but I've got my gloves on. I'm ready to ready to fight back.
Now, if you could rename ADHD to something a little less disordery, would you have something you would rather call it?
Yeah, okay. So I wrote down 2 things. So the first one is serious. Okay. So I thought attention variation and executive function variability spectrum. That is gross, I know, but I think that there is a way to make it spell FAVES, like faves. You would just have to like rework that. But like, I like the words variation and spectrum, that are part
Yeah.
of that, because I feel like, and not to co-opt ASD language again, but I feel like it I mean, there is just so much, like, there are so many differences within ADHD people that it is a spectrum, right? I mean, everything's a spectrum. Gender is a spectrum. Life is a spectrum. Everything's a spectrum. So I think that the word spectrum has to be included. And that's my like serious one. And then my funny one, because I feel like you need two to kind of show like the two parts of me, right? Is the number 80 with HD, like high def, because we have 80 things going on in our head in high def all at the same time. So that's my funny one.
I love that. Yeah, I think Connor DeWolf has ADHDs, where it's literally just HD 80 times on a sweatshirt that he sells that in his merch store, which is great because it's like we're the only ones who would get that joke anyway. So we love inside jokes. Yeah, that is awesome. It's true. Oh, that's good. I like that. I think executive function really needs to be brought to rise to the top in terms of attention issues, and especially for women. I think executive function is really where you start to understand the depths to which something as simple as dopamine deficiency can really sort of affect all of these, pockets of your life in ways that are just so profound.
Oh yeah, that's been my life, chasing the dopamine. It has just been one giant dopamine conquest, whether it's like, oh, I should be working, but I'm on Amazon buying shower curtains, or like, oh, I should be cleaning the apartment, but instead, hear me out, I am going to watch true crime for another 3 hours, and we'll come back to that idea of cleaning later on, or like, we're going to hop into this new relationship. We're not ready, but we're definitely ready right now to just go ahead and get engaged. Let's do all the things now, because I need dopamine like this minute. So chasing the dopamine. I mean, I might get that tattooed somewhere. Who knows?
Right? I know.
Yeah.
Well, that is great. I'm so glad we had this conversation, and I know that there are going to be so many people who are going to listen to your story and be so appreciative of sharing your journey. And I mean, I think that's how we are learning about ourselves and really kind of learning at changing the face of ADHD is sharing our stories. So I'm so glad that you've been able to listen to other women's stories and through the podcast, and that they've helped you, and that now we can kind of go full circle and,
Oh yeah, I
and
love
share
it.
your
I love
own.
it. Yeah, that's one of the things I do as an anthropologist. So I share stories for social change, and so part of the way that I try to shape food policy is I share my story of what it was like to grow up in a really food insecure household with like our governor, and like our state ag commissioner, and things like that. And I try to get other people to share their stories of hunger too, to help combat food insecurity in the state. So I am a huge storyteller. I love storytelling. And so I was immediately like, okay, this is my podcast. Like, this is it. I'm obsessed with this. I've been hyper focused for so long now. I'm like, oh, time to watch a new episode.
Yeah, right. Well, from GED to PhD,
With
with some
ADHD.
ADHD on the side. I love it. Uh, well, that's great. So now what is your PhD? I know, what is your actual PhD thesis on? Or
Right. So I am studying food pantries and food banking during COVID, and kind of how these emergency food relief systems are able to work with a huge crisis when they themselves were already in a crisis. So just kind of seeing like how they handle it, but really also how people who visit the food bank have to form these like mutual aid networks to survive, because food banks aren't able to completely handle the load of hunger in America.
Mhm.
It's just so profound right now. And so I have a really unique interest in seeing how the people kind of navigate around different mutual aid networks, and maybe help each other, and form communities of solidarity to stave off hunger.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to me how many people with ADHD tend to end up in those empathetic social services roles, like teachers and social workers. Like, I get it. I understand why, but it just seems doubly tragic that people who feel things so deeply and are so, it, I think, there's, again, I think this could be a whole other episode just about like the ways in which
Yeah.
we experience trauma in our society, right? And how much ADHD is linked to the trauma experience. And like I said, like there's so many times on this podcast where I'm like, is it ADHD or am I just a feminist? Or is it ADHD or am I just this? Like it just feels like it's we will probably spend our lives trying to kind of figure out how all of this overlaps. And it's fascinating. So
Yeah, that was me. I was like, is it ADHD or is it just trauma?
yeah, well then, but then it's like, can you find somebody in America who, especially a woman who hasn't experienced trauma at this point? Like,
No.
that's the other thing is like, every person I've interviewed has gone through a lot of trauma, but then I'm like, does the trauma-free woman exist? I haven't found her yet.
No, no, I mean, I don't even know how that would be possible. I'm trying to think how like a trauma-free woman would exist. I mean, I don't want to like, talk about the last couple of years in this country, but especially after the last couple of years,
Right. I
what
know.
we've all
Well,
kind of went through together.
yeah, well, I think I'm so immersed in ADHD community that I kind of forget neurotypicals exist until I meet them. And so like I remember like, my sister-in-law who's very neurotypical, who like came to visit us over New Year's, where I was like, oh right, I forgot about you people. Who
That's, that's,
um
like, that's
yeah,
like the
but it was
one
sort of
good thing about object permanence. Like, oh,
yeah.
neurotypicals exist, right? I forgot that you all were out, and when you meet them.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you again. I really, really appreciate you sitting down with me and sharing your story. I had a feeling it was going to be a great conversation. So thank you. And
Thank
then
you.
you'll get an email. I think it's like an automated email. I think it comes out an hour after we finish. So it'll just asking for a bio and a picture for me to use on Instagram. I don't know if you've seen the Instagram feed, but I usually like, have some images. So I have been doing a lot of interviews in January. So I get really excited and I like start to book a lot of interviews. And then all of a sudden I'm like 6 months down, I'm like, I'm airing interviews 6 months after they've been recorded, which so I like try to like do it in fits and starts. But this episode will be airing in the beginning of April, just to give you a heads up so that you're not like, what the hell happened? I will be in touch. Don't worry. But that's basically the turnaround at this point is like 2.5 months. So, but I will be in touch. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, Alisha. It was so lovely to meet you.
Thank you. It was so nice to meet you too, and I'll be listening again tonight.
Awesome. All right. Well, take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.